This video is brought to you by Imprint.
The Saudi economy isn't having a good time at the moment. Despite spending trillions of petrodollars on everything from golf to gaming, the economy is still overwhelmingly dependent on oil, and fell into recession last year for the first time since the pandemic. On top of that, a few weeks ago, the Saudis quietly cut their growth forecast for 2024 from 4.4% to just 0.8%, and Bloomberg now estimates that their so-called break-even price, the global price of oil required for the Saudis to balance their budgets, has risen to $112 per barrel, an all-time high and way above the current price of about $75. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the Saudi economy and why Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 program really isn't going to plan.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos.
So let's start with a bit of context. As one of the world's largest oil producers and its largest exporter, Saudi Arabia's economy is dominated by oil. The oil sector accounts for roughly 90% of export earnings, 80% of state budget revenues, and 40% of GDP. Although much of that remaining 60% of GDP is also in some way dependent on the kingdom spending its oil revenues. Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 program, first announced in 2016, aims to reduce the kingdom's dependence on oil, for both economic and political reasons. Politically, it's a problem because oil alone just can't provide enough jobs to keep the growing Saudi population employed, and creates a vast inequality between those in oil and non-oil sectors. Economically, an over-reliance on oil won't be sustainable if oil demand declines in the coming decades. But even if demand for oil persists, it would still leave the economy at the mercy of oil price cycles. Now, weaning the Saudi economy off oil was always going to be difficult. In practice, diversifying an economy away from oil involves both developing your export-led industries to the point that they're internationally competitive and don't need to be subsidized by oil revenues, and developing your domestic economy by making citizens more economically active, which means more domestic demand and less reliance on imports. You can do this by investing in education, building infrastructure, and providing cheap loans to small businesses. Both of these were always going to be particularly difficult in the Saudi context. When it comes to export-led industries, Saudi Arabia doesn't really have traditional export-led industries like agriculture or manufacturing. So this meant focusing instead on stuff like tourism, which has proven more difficult to increase. When it comes to the domestic economy, again, Saudi Arabia doesn't really have one, and most domestic economic activity is actually driven by oil revenues being redirected by the government. 2 in 3 working Saudis are employed by the state, and their wages are essentially paid with oil revenues, which in turn fuels the domestic economy. On top of this, countries that have successfully avoided an overdependence on oil, the most notable example being Norway, have achieved this by withholding most oil revenues and investing the remainder over long periods of time. This is in large part because immature economies can only cope with so much investment, and too much money often leads to what economists sometimes euphemistically describe as overheating, manifest as high inflation and asset bubbles, like the UAE's ongoing property bubble. The timeline outlined by MBS in Vision 2030, however, is remarkably short. By 2030, MBS wants the private sector to account for 65% of GDP, with half of that coming from SMEs, non-oil products to account for 50% of all exports, and renewables to generate 50% of the country's electricity. This is, at least in part, because the economic reforms outlined in Vision 2030 have been accompanied by some pretty drastic political and social reforms. To encourage foreign investment and enable the growth of the entertainment and tourism industries, MBS has pursued some conspicuously liberal social reforms, at least by Saudi standards, including allowing women to drive, work, and travel, the abolition of the religious police, and even its first alcohol shop in 70 years. These reforms, as well as modernizing reforms to the education system, which used to be almost entirely religious, have created tensions with the conservative clergy in Saudi Arabia, and this is one of the big reasons MBS is spending so much so fast. He wants to keep the people employed and happy, so the clergy don't have the political space to resist his reforms, as they have done in the past. 1979 is the best example of this. After conservative Islamists seized the Grand Mosque, Saudi Arabia's modernization, which had actually come pretty far, was effectively halted. Anyway, to achieve the Vision 2030 goals, the Saudi government is spending a ridiculous amount of money. Last year, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, the PIF, spent an astonishing $30 billion, making it the highest spending wealth fund in the world. And this is due to rise to $70 billion by 2025. The PIF has now invested in just about everything, from golf to gaming, and set up 93 domestic companies to diversify the economy, ranging from a solar panel company to a Saudi coffee company. At the same time, though, government spending has spiked, rising by roughly 50% compared to 2016. Now, as we mentioned in the intro, this massive increase in spending means that the so-called break-even price for the Saudis is now a ridiculous $112 per barrel, according to recent Bloomberg calculations, which include PIF spending. For context, the Saudis' break-even price has hovered around $60 for most of recent history. Unfortunately for the Saudis, Brent crude is currently trading well below this, at about $74 a barrel, where it's hovered for most of the past year, despite ongoing geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. In the past, the Saudis might have been able to push the price of oil via OPEC, a Saudi-led cartel of oil-producing states that was expanded to OPEC Plus in 2016. However, a rise in non-OPEC production, including from Canada, Brazil, and Guyana, but especially from the US with the shale boom, has both meant structurally lower prices and undermined OPEC Plus's ability to control the market. The Saudis have been trying to overcome this with some drastic production cuts, but this hasn't gone down well with poorer OPEC Plus members, who've either refused to comply or just quit the bloc entirely. The PIF cash pile has duly fallen from about $50 billion to just $15 billion in September, while the Saudi government has started running successive budget deficits and admitted in September that it was looking at roughly a 3% deficit this year, well up from the 1.9% originally forecast. To make matters worse, all this money hasn't really made much of a difference. While non-oil GDP has increased, that's largely because GDP includes any investment, regardless of whether or not it's productive, as evidenced by the recent paring back of headline-grabbing investments like MBS's Neom City, the Saudi golf venture, or the Saudi Football League, which would also explain why non-oil exports have essentially stagnated. All in all, while Saudi Arabia isn't going to run out of cash anytime soon, or ever, as Vision 2030 falters, the kingdom is left at a bit of a loose end.
Fans of TLDR like you care about understanding the world around them. That's where today's sponsor Imprint comes into play. If you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a new way to learn that turns your phone from an attention-sucking device to a tool for growth. You may have heard this before, but unless you've used the app, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in and day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, and quick reads you can consume in a single sitting. Since we last spoke to you about Imprint in September, I've done the philosophy course and am focusing on their course on the science of happiness. People study how to get in shape, how to eat right, and how to advance in their career. Understanding how humans are wired to be happy has been an interesting path to go down that I highly recommend to all of you. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. Plus, if you use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.